You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol for Medicine and the Machine podcast, and I'm really thrilled today to welcome Stephen Thrasher, who is the Daniel Renberg Chair of Social Justice at Northwestern Journalism. And he has a new book called The Viral Underclass that we're going to talk about. So welcome, Stephen.
Thanks so much for having me, Eric. It's nice to see you outside of Twitter.
Yeah, same here. You have a remarkable background. So before we get to the book, I thought we'd just talk a little bit about your beginnings. I know you grew up in part here in California. And maybe you could just take us through that and NYU to the SNL when you were actually working at. I wonder what it's like to work for Saturday Night Live. So maybe tell us about the pre, earlier part of your career and upbringing.
Yeah, I did grow up in Oxnard, California, Southern California. Moved to New York City when I was 17 to go to film school at my first round with NYU. And I did work at SNL as a senior and my first year out. It wasn't as glamorous as it might sound. I was a writer's research assistant on the weekend update desk my first year, and then a staff writer's assistant. I worked in film production for years. Most formative for me was working on a film called The Laramie Project about Matthew Shepard, itself based upon an oral history attempt and approach to making theater about the murder of Matthew Shepard by the Tectonic Theater Company. Eventually ended up as a staff writer for the Village Voice, where I worked for a few years and did feature writing and was really covering the same-sex marriage movement through the country, and started writing about actually HIV and AIDS a little bit in those years. I ended up at Northwestern, where I have this great job both in the journalism school and this job that focuses on social justice journalism and LGBTQ people. And I also have an appointment in the med school where I work in an institute for LGBTQ health and work with our Center for AIDS Research. And so I try to continue doing my journalism and also do peer-reviewed research and try to sometimes blend the techniques of the two together. And I'm really privileged to get to teach journalism students about health and medicine and LGBTQ people, and sometimes to teach medical students about how to communicate.
Well, that's quite a rich background, and it gets us to when you were thinking about writing The Viral Underclass and trying to get into the intersection of how viruses like HIV and COVID would have really a devastating effect on whether it's people of color or disabled or the impoverished or whoever. When did you come to this eureka idea that you really should devote a lot of effort? I know you've been an investigative journalist, but when did it occur to you that this really needed to be dissected?
Shortly before I began my PhD, I ended up doing what I thought would be my last journalism story, but I'm still working on it 8 years later. The story of a young man named Michael Johnson who'd been arrested for alleged HIV exposure and transmission, and he was facing life in prison. And it was a case that brought up almost every disaster of health in the carceral state in Black America, and also brought up many issues around sexuality. And through that case, I started understanding the ways that criminal justice was a really poor way to deal with public health, but also saw the ways that anxieties about race and sexuality and disease can get heaped on very few people. Michael's story was being reported in Australia as if he was somehow a global menace to HIV when 35, 40 million people around the world are living with HIV. And it became apparent to me pretty quickly that it might be something I'd work on for a long time. The month I started graduate school, I started writing for The Guardian, and I was not supposed to travel or anything for that job. I was going to write about, just sort of comment on politics. But when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, an editor heard that I'd already spent time working on the Michael Johnson story, also in the St. Louis region, and they sent me there. And Ferguson had this higher rate of AIDS. And so I started seeing that there was this real overlap between the ways that particularly Black Americans were facing policing concentrations of poverty, police violence, arrest, and also HIV and AIDS, that these maps were very overlapping. And that was kind of my first aha moment. And so I wrote my dissertation about this relationship. It was called Infectious Blackness, and I wrote about the relationship of prosecuting HIV, how and why HIV and AIDS have become so lodged in Black America within the United States. I looked at how before and after the advent of antiretroviral medications, we actually saw a greater disparity of who was living with AIDS after the medication. The medication did not iron out these disparities. And that was the basis of my doctoral work. And when I finished it, I was trying to figure out what would become of it, if I was going to make a book out of it. I started in this job at Northwestern, and I found out that I could actually write a trade book. And so I was trying to figure out what form it would take when COVID happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know if I would still have a job. I didn't know if there, would be a book to sell. I didn't know, who was going to live or die from this pandemic. And my agent very wisely looked back at my dissertation and realized the last chapter was called The Viral Underclass. And I had ended my dissertation in sort of an open and hopeful way, looking at activists who were trying to repeal the laws that criminalized HIV. And there was a debate amongst them of seeing how a viral underclass, a term that had been coined by someone who'd started the group many years before, to talk about HIV criminalization in general. But this group of activists were saying, if the laws were just reformed and not abolished, if we started having HIV laws where they said, okay, everyone's getting prosecuted for it, but people who have an undetectable viral load should not, they were saying this would create a viral underclass, pointing out the ways that people who still had detectable viral loads were going to become even more criminalized. And the reason why people have detectable viral loads is often because they're poor, they don't have consistent access to medication, often because they're homeless. And so Tanya, my agent, said, think about using that as an analytic. And so that was also kind of the big aha moment that I had when I started doing that, because I realized as COVID cases were happening and as COVID deaths were happening in March and April of 2020, they were geographically happening in places and cities that I was quite familiar with, because they were the areas where there were high concentrations of HIV and AIDS. And in a way, this didn't fully make sense, because the novel coronavirus and HIV are very, very different viruses in many respects, and how they transmit and the timescales they work on, but the concentrations of them were happening in similar places. And so that was kind of the aha moment where I realized a framework of a viral underclass can help me understand and help us understand why very different viruses are affecting similar populations, even if the particularities of those viruses are quite different.
Yeah, and it was actually extraordinary how there's independent replication of a second virus with these same remarkable themes. And I guess maybe you'd like to comment, but the United States seems to be especially uh, vulnerable, poised to have these inequities because of its system of lacking any universal health care access, and unlike any other industrialized nation. Maybe you could comment about that part of it.
Yeah, so in the U.S. was those of us who study these things were terrified in February and March and April of 2020, because it's like we were living in a house of kindling and we saw the match coming. My point of entry of concern was really rooted in thinking about AIDS, poverty, and race. And the history of that in the United States is that medications became available in 1996, but they didn't get to some other countries for another 7 years. And yet, even within the US, we had this horrible racial disparity. In 2016, the CDC projected that if things did not change, 1 in every 2 Black gay men like myself would become HIV positive in our lifetime. And so even though I'm HIV negative is my last test, this is something that I think about a lot and negotiate with my friends. And the writer Linda Villarosa very poetically wrote about how if Black gay men were a country in the United States, if we were our own country, we would have the highest rate of HIV on Earth. And so I realized one of the reasons why that is is because of poverty and also lack of health insurance. HIV is so slow acting. From the time people become infected, it can take 5, 7, 10 years for them to become seriously ill. It could take maybe as many as 15 years for them to die if they're not treated. And yet there are still people in the Mississippi River Delta showing up in ERs with end stage AIDS symptoms and only living for a couple of weeks before they die. And there's no reason for that to happen, except that these are people who've just never seen a doctor and they've been discarded by the society in all kinds of ways already. And so knowing the context of that and how this virus, we've had medication for 26, I guess 24 years when COVID started, about 26 years now, and knowing how prevalent it still is in certain sectors of the United States made me really terrified about what would happen with COVID, particularly given that it's a much more efficient virus that transmits much more easily. And that it would be coming into a healthcare system that would be totally overwhelmed with dealing with it in any way.
Yeah, well, there's no question about that. And it's still going, even though we've heard about the pandemic being over, which couldn't be really further from the truth in terms of where things are headed. Now, I wonder if you could go back for a moment. I know the whole work you did with Michael Tiger Mendigo Johnson was very impactful, and you start out the book with that, and it's a theme across the book of viral underclass. But was your writing about his situation, the whole the fact that he had a 30-year jail time and was reduced to 5? Did you help him get out early?
I did, or I think that the reporting that we did at BuzzFeed did. He had mostly been portrayed just as a monster and had very negative press coverage, and almost everyone in his life had abandoned him. He wasn't able to get much help. The first 2 years I worked on the case, the national organizations would not touch the case. The NAACP, the Human Rights Campaign, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, not even the ACLU, not even the AIDS organizations were having anything to do with him. It was a dynamic that historically and shamefully reminded me of when the NAACP would not take cases where charges of rape had come into the equation. And those cases were often when people ended up being lynched or executed. The Scottsboro boys did not get representation from them and ended up being executed eventually. Um, and so I was able to tell his story much more fully, and a lot of activists came up around him and started helping him. And armed with some of the things that I had reported in my work, they were able to raise money, got another attorney to help them do an appeal, and mounted a successful appeal. And the sentence was overturned. And one of the things that I wish that they had ruled on, which they just put to the side, was the unconstitutionality of the laws themselves, that they are needlessly and cruelly impacting people who have something that's considered a disability under the ADA in a way, and yeah, it's leaving people in prison for life. But yeah, I feel very happy and proud that I could play a role as a reporter to raise information that was helpful in him getting out of prison.
Well, that's really so gratifying to hear. I wonder, when you're an investigative journalist and you actually can help action, enable action like that, that's got to be, a whole other reward cycle, that all the work you put in, that you can actually affect change, especially saving 25 years of a prison sentence. And a man that was recklessly put in prison and given such a ridiculous, extreme sentence.
Thank you. The day he got out of prison was one of the greatest days of my life, and I
Mhm.
felt very happy that he wanted me to be there. And as a
Wow.
reporter, you often don't get to see the end of your stories. And I'm
Yeah.
happy. I mean, his story goes on, and he's doing well and living his life. But it's very rare that you get to report on something that seems unsolvable and that you get to see it come to its conclusion. And so getting to see him come out of prison, and recently he sent me a picture of himself holding my book. And I just feel really happy
Wow.
that I got to live long enough to see him get out and see him go on his way.
Oh, that's fantastic. Oh, thanks for sharing that. Now, you wrote about the 12 interconnected social vectors between HIV and COVID. And I wonder if you could just speak a bit about that, because these are all such vital forces in our lives, and you might not be able to go run through all 12 of them, straight away. But if you could just comment on the ones that really, like, you know, I'm interested, especially not just about racism, individualized shame, capitalism, but also the prison state, carceral state, speciesism. That's one I thought was interesting. Obviously, ableism, um, the myth of white immunity. Maybe just give us a bit of color or flavor on what your thoughts are about the connected vectors.
Sure. So, when I was doing my dissertation work, I was really thinking about HIV criminalization and race. And this project expands out because I'm seeing race as a factor, but there are all these other ways that a viral underclass is made. And particularly, I think the COVID-19 pandemic creates an opportunity for a lot of solidarity with white people as well, and with people who've been affected in different ways. So there are 12 different ways that a viral underclass, I think, gets perpetuated across different kinds of viruses and across within the United States, different presidential administrations. The Trump administration obviously was extremely reckless and irresponsible in all kinds of ways with COVID, but the death toll under the Biden administration is now, about 150% of what Trump's was, and there are multiple reasons for that. But a very strong one, I think, is that our carceral state hasn't changed. The United States has 4% of the world's people. We have about 25% of the world's incarcerated people. At many times, we've had about 25% of COVID cases and 25% of COVID deaths. We have about 35% of monkeypox cases. And the prison itself is such an important vector in spreading disease. It brings people together who are already predetermined to have all kinds of health outcomes and economic instability, and has them all in one place. The prison itself can become a site of transmission, particularly with, it happens with HIV too, but also with hepatitis, tuberculosis, and most recently, of course, COVID-19, because COVID's so casually transmitted, it moves very freely in these spaces. And with jails more than prisons, people are coming in and they're leaving, and they're coming in and they're leaving. And so the jails themselves are these transmission points, but they also create sort of what I call secondary engines, that once somebody has been incarcerated, they're getting put into all these other sort of vectors that are making them likely to have bad health outcomes. Once you're incarcerated, you're much more likely to become homeless, particularly because of the terms of the Welfare Reform Act during the Clinton administration that said that people who've had drug arrests, not even convictions, but just arrests, cannot live in public housing. And that's one of the reasons why Black homelessness increased so much in the 1990s. People have been incarcerated. It becomes almost impossible to get work in the formal economy, certainly work that gives you enough money for health insurance and good health outcomes. So the prisons are creating these secondary engines, particularly amongst Black people. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen AIDS rates for Black Americans are still a bit higher than they ever were for white Americans before there were
Mm.
medications, even though we've had medications for like 25 years. Speciesism was probably the biggest learning curve for me in writing this book. And I don't actually remember where I first heard about it. I have a number of friends who are animal studies scholars. But of course, like everyone who studies viruses, I've been going beyond my comfort level and crash course learning everything I could about COVID. 3 years ago, crash course learning about orthopox viruses and monkeypox this summer. And the role of animals, non-human animals, is really important to understand kind of where they came from, but also the relationship that creates their ongoing transmission. And so HIV is largely believed to probably have jumped into humans from simian immunodeficiency virus when colonialists were pushing African porters into what's now Congo in the 1920s. And it was probably in extracting those resources and killing bushmeat that probably people butchering the animals had the virus coming through the cuts in their body. Very, very common form of transmission, still happens now in slaughterhouses and on factory kill floors when people cut themselves doing butcher acting as butchers, it's a big way that viruses jump into human beings. And so I wanted to understand this relationship more. And speciesism is a way that human beings imagine ourselves at the top of a pyramid. We see ourselves as the best animals, if we even think of ourselves as animals, dominating all others. And there's a real case, which one of the people I talked to in the book, Alice Wong, says, for thinking that viruses are the superior organism. They're certainly much more efficient than humans. And I think we should have a respect of them and a respect of other animals. And as climate change pushes more living beings onto a smaller chunk of the globe, we're going to have potentially many more zoonotic jumps. Monkeypox as well didn't come from monkeys, but comes from other animals. And understanding these relationships and maybe not seeing human beings as just having to dominate all other animals and have no sense of respect or boundaries, or needing to give space for certain creatures that we don't go into their territory, creates many conditions that can lead to viral transmission. And for me, I thought, just thinking about the interdependence that happens with disabled patients and the way the disabled people think of having a sense of independence, not independence, but understanding we have connections to one another and we're negotiating with one another. I think seeing ourselves as interdependent with other species can help us create better conditions of which viruses are not flowing so freely and spilling into human beings in ways that can be very, very deadly for us.
Yeah, no, it's a really critical point with all the different reservoirs that have been established to exist with COVID as an example, not just white-tailed deer, but hamsters and I mean, just, cats and all sorts of mammals where there's a reservoir and potential, as you say, spillover or incubation of new variants that would come back to haunt us, in fact. Now, what I really also am impressed with is that you didn't just leave us with all this downers, how bad things are, how the structural inequalities, they're really overpowering. But you also came up with the idea of a map. This could be a map for a worldwide liberation. Maybe you could expound on that.
I feel like viruses have taught me a lot, and I've been thinking about this since I first started getting into gay activism and AIDS activism. And I realized that I'm the beneficiary of all this work that was done by people in ACT UP and people who were organized around AIDS in the 1980s and 1990s, and that there's been huge political benefit from that. ACT UP has informed all kinds of social movements, I would say, including the Black Lives Matter movement and the Occupy Wall Street movement. And movements don't always have an immediate success. We saw the president get behind canceling some student debt from activism work that began during Occupy Wall Street 11 years ago. And so I have almost a sense of survivor's guilt, or I've had at times. I try not to. I try not to embrace that, but I've had a bit of a sense of survivor's guilt, knowing that so much of my life as a gay man and the culture that I'm part of is predicated upon the horrors of AIDS in the 80s and 90s. And so I try to think that the viruses are teachers. They teach us unwittingly, but there are lessons that we can learn from them about how to organize our world better at a very practical level. What AIDS activists did to respond to AIDS is one of the reasons why billions of people have now been vaccinated for COVID relatively quickly, because they upended the process through which vaccines and medications were underwent regulatory review and got them into people much quicker when they could save millions of lives. So in that way, I think that viruses have taught us a lot. But as we think about climate change, as we think about the migration patterns that are going to be caused by climate change and other political problems we're facing, I think that viruses give us this map of understanding there is no distinct me and distinct you. There's always this organic material that potentially can be transmitting between us, and our fates are very linked to one another. And there are practical ways to think about it that go beyond nation. With the monkeypox outbreak this summer, there was a Nigerian doctor who saw monkeypox behaving very differently and thought there was probably some kind of mutation that made it start to move sexually in Nigeria in 2017. And he wrote a paper about it and asked for resources and help to study it. And the world mostly ignored him. The United States certainly ignored him. Had the United States been supportive of research happening in other parts of the world that does not quote unquote directly affect us, then we might not be dealing with the monkeypox outbreak now. And I think viruses are continually telling us that the fates of people on the globe are connected to each other. The risk we always have is not the same, but our fates are very connected to one another. And so as we think about climate change and the changes that are just going to happen in the world, there were lots of lessons that we've had in the past few years. But the most powerful to me is that viruses have taught me that we're always going to have a connection to one another, whether we like it or not. And the borders that we imagine to be very strong around gender, around race, or around nationality are kind of fictions. The viruses can cross between them, and they give us a map for learning how to work with one another in an interconnected way.
Yeah, if only we take the right kind of action to do that learning and understand our interconnectedness. Now, I guess to wrap things up, I wonder where you go from here. You've had this extraordinary book. It was just published in August, and you must be thinking about what's next. Besides, of course, your teaching and the lucky students that have you at Northwestern and in classes. But what would you think you'll concentrate your efforts for in the next chapter of your career?
Most immediately, I am enjoying teaching and having time with students right now. Um, I have been working a lot on monkeypox this summer, and many of the lessons that I learned from COVID and from writing this book were applicable with monkeypox. And so I did get to kind of write some contextual things, but I also was in a very brass tacks way, helping organize how to get information out to the community and how to help people quickly get vaccinated and things of that nature. And I have a couple of projects that I'm thinking through next. One is about the role of Black police officers in the United States. I'd started working on this before the pandemic and realizing and policing has a big role with how viruses transmit. But I started realizing that many of the social injustices I saw happening because of police seemed to be ameliorated when we were seeing more Black police officers in actual jobs and also
Mm.
depicted in fiction. Um, in Hennepin County, where I reported on George Floyd, it's the county is like 82% white, but there are three people running for sheriff. Two of them are Black and one is South Asian. So I'm working on some things around that. And then I'm going back to what was the original version of this book in a way, where I was writing about the Michael Johnson case in relation to my family and being a queer person. And I'm working on something about when we think relationships are legitimate and illegitimate. And that's kind of the next thing that I will be working on. But it's a lot of talking about the book this year and trying to make sure that COVID doesn't get forgotten, and also trying to make sure monkeypox does not get abandoned
Yeah, yeah.
prematurely here in the States.
Absolutely. Just because the cases are going down, that's certainly a long way from getting control of monkeypox. And as you've aptly pointed out, the other viruses and pathogens that we have to be facing. Young people now will think that this was, every 100-year pandemic, perhaps, and they don't have to worry about one for the rest of their lives. And I think we know better that, unfortunately, because of climate change and the environment and so many other factors, we're going to be facing, whether it's the families of viruses we've already seen, the mutations on top of the viruses that have resulted in, as you said, monkeypox, or the recrudescence of polio, and so many. This has just been a wake up call as to infectious diseases. I never knew anything about infectious diseases until I had to become a COVIDologist to see if I could help. But all the things that you just mentioned, Stephen, sound really alluring. Your ability to go deep and really explain, a master explainer. These are such great qualities. I hope you'll have a chance to get into each of those topics that you just mentioned. Well, all will benefit from it. So thanks so much for the great work you've done already. The viral underclass is a really important contribution that I hope all the medical community gets and really benefits from. And we look forward to talking to you more, especially I know my co-host, Abraham Verghese, who is sick today. He sends his regrets, but I know he's going to be contacting you for a more extended conversation in the months ahead. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you. It was my real honor to be here.